Yeah, I think President Putin decided that all of his efforts to talk us into some level of understanding had
Mhm.
failed. And having failed to persuade us that Russia would not tolerate NATO membership for Ukraine and would not tolerate the eventual positioning of NATO forces, especially NATO missiles, long range strike weapons in eastern Ukraine, led him to conclude he had to go in and demonstrate just how serious he was. I think he made a number of assumptions about how this would work out, turned out to be invalid. One of his assumptions was that the United States, in particular, the leadership in Washington, as well as the leadership in Kiev, would want to negotiate. That they would want to
Right.
avoid a wider war. I don't think he was prepared for what turned out to be the opposite. So the first going in proposition was we're going in with limited numbers of troops. We're going a short distance into eastern Ukraine, principally into those areas where the majority of the population speaks Russian. And we plan to demonstrate that we are serious and we want to negotiate. And he outlines certain things that he wanted. Number one, obviously, Ukraine had to be neutral, not a member of NATO,
Right.
neutrality. Didn't go into great detail about what that neutrality would mean, but probably something close to Austria or Finland. Secondly, he thought, well, there are two provinces that are, or oblasts, whatever you want to call them, that are breakaway, Donetsk and Luhansk, and they should have the right to live as Russians inside Ukraine, have equal rights
Yeah.
as Russians as Ukrainian citizens, enjoy some measure of autonomy. And then, of course, there's the issue of Crimea. Please recognize the legitimacy of Russian control of Crimea, which, from the standpoint of the Russians, having conquered it in the 1770s, is a self evident truth. Now, in addition to that, he also talked about eventually having a Russian representative sit on the equivalent of the Ukrainian National Security Council, simply as a representative of Russian interests to that Security Council. That's about it. And I think he was quite surprised that there was no real willingness to seriously consider it. Now, we do have evidence towards the end of March, after
Yeah.
the war had been going on for 6 weeks, that Mr. Zelensky said, well, we could live with neutrality. And when that
Right.
word seems to have reached Washington and
Right.
London, people became incensed,
Took the
and
trip.
Boris
Yeah.
Johnson represented Washington's interests and said, absolutely not. We will support you to the bitter end. You must stand your ground and fight for every inch of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin, unlike his predecessors, really does know something about the West. If we go back through many Soviet and Russian leaders over centuries, very few had actually traveled outside of their homeland. That's not the case with Vladimir Putin. And he is predisposed to cooperate with the West,
Right.
not just on a business level, but also on a cultural
Yeah.
sense. He did not want to convey the impression that there was anything Soviet like about the current state. And so he was not going to send forces into Ukraine that would be destructive. He gave strict orders to the forces that went in there. I don't want you to kill civilians. I want you to minimize losses in the civilian population. Try not to destroy infrastructure. And I think his assumption was that we would somehow or another figure out what his intentions were. We were never really interested in his intentions. In fact, from our vantage point, I think we thought this war was manna from heaven. This new Ukrainian army that we'd invested so heavily in could win. And we mistook, the underlying assumptions that shaped the initial operation as evidence for weakness. But we know that in April and May, there were several meetings and several discussions because the feedback that was coming from Ukraine, from the Russians living in Ukraine, was very interesting. Because the Russian troops told them, well, we're here to liberate you, but we're not staying. And so the Russian speaking population said, well, if you're not going to stay, as soon as you leave, if we cooperate with you, the Ukrainian secret police that we call the SBU will come here, shoot all of us in the head. So if you're not going to stay, literally, the hell with you. We're not going to support it. This became increasingly obvious as the war drew on. And that was the first thing. The second thing was we sent very hostile signals. You go back to March and listen to President Biden's speech, which was the famous regime change speech by accident, that until Putin is removed and this state is transformed into something that meets our standards, there can be no peace. And I think it took a while for that to sink in. And suddenly, by the beginning of the summer, it was very clear that what they had done would not secure Russia. They never had more than 20% of their ground force engaged. That is a very small contingent, about 190,000 troops initially. And then it became clear that that was going to be inadequate because the war was not going to end with the capture of these territories. So there, at some point in the summer, there was a meeting between the General Staff, the Stavka, and I think President Putin. And his question was, well, what do we have to do to win this war, to end it? Because the key issue is not just we want to win on the battlefield. We want to win in such a way as we bring this war to a close. Well, people were always shown these marvelous films of Russian tanks being destroyed by various things, javelin missiles, and of course the one weapon system the British are using, this light anti-tank weapon system, which is really very, very good. It's turned out to be much more effective than the javelin, based on the reports coming in. And the Russians looked at all of this and said, well, Mr. President, if you want us to win this and bring this to a close, we have to make fundamental change in all of the assumptions. And first and foremost, we have to move over to the strategic defensive. And this is going to have to be, for the time being, an economy of force operation because we don't have enough forces. Not only are you going to have to bring in most of the regular army, the active force, we're going to need additional reservists and volunteers. What's really interesting on the Russian side is the enormous success which they've had with volunteers, not just Chechnya, but also within Russia itself. So this changed the character, but then the decision was, well, if we're going to hold this territory, and this is when Surovikin is named the new commander, he said, I'm happy to hold this territory, but I don't want to be committed to holding every inch of this. If I feel it's necessary to withdraw somewhere to economize so to be more successful elsewhere, I want to be able to do that. And President Putin said, you are now the theater commander. You are in command. Everyone takes orders from you. So there was a restructuring of the commands to ensure that he was now the final say on any operational item that occurred in the theater. That was not the case earlier. The Russians have an advantage, though, over us. They understand that ground in and of itself has no real value unless it confers a military advantage on you. There's no point in just holding onto ground for the sake of saying, well, here on the map, I've drawn a line and I'll go no further, which, of course, was the Hitlerian mistake that lost the war in the East, or one of them. And the bottom line is, he said, look, we're not going to defend something that we can easily retake when we decide it's necessary. We're going to stay where we think we can defend effectively. And so for weeks, I was being asked by people, well, the Russians withdrew 10 kilometers here. They withdrew 20 here. And so aren't they in retreat? Is this not evidence for Russian decay and a crumbling defense? Never. It never was. But all of these things were approved by Surovikin. He made it very clear that local commanders had authority to do what made sense, but he was still in command, and these decisions had to be checked with him.
Several thousand, I don't know the total number, 9,000, 10,000 Russian troops are going into Belarus to form this operational group together with the Belarus military. I don't know if this is pre-existing Russian units or if they're units that have been freed up because of the partial mobilization. But I think that the partial mobilization is encompassing the totality of the frontage, one way or another, either directly or indirectly, meaning those troops that are in Belarus, if they're not from the partial mobilization, have been freed up because of the partial mobilization. So these 300,000 are giving the Russians a tremendous flexibility, operational flexibility that will stress the Ukrainians from a strategic planning concept. The Ukrainians now have to worry. Kiev is back in play. Western Ukraine is back in play. Odessa is in play. The battle for the Donbass is ongoing. Kherson is in play. The Kharkov's in play. Everything's in play. So the Ukrainians don't get to sit there and go, aha, we're going to play with Limon, and we're going to play with Kherson, and we're going to do this. They now have to worry about everything. And this is where the Russians have the upper hand, because even though the Ukrainians might have the numbers, they don't have the capacity. Because in addition to, while we're talking this numbers game, let me put it this way. The Russian trains are moving freely in Russia. Russian traffic on Russian roads is moving freely. When the troops stop for the night, they get to stay in warm accommodations. They're eating hot food. They get to call home on a functioning internet service. Ukrainians, on the other hand, not. The electrical grid is being shut down by Russian action. There's rolling blackouts throughout the country. Their economy is a total wreck. It's a bleak outlook for the Ukrainian civilians going into this winter. And all of that has to have a gnawing effect on the Ukrainian military, because these are men who have wives, sisters, mothers, brothers, uncles, grandfathers back there who are suffering. I think that the combination of the partial mobilization, which is reinvigorating the Russians and increasing their strength, combined with what's happening to Ukraine because of the strategic air campaign and et cetera, combined with, and this is another factor that's very important because it's all taking place at the same time, what's happening in Europe and the United States. The cheerleading days are pretty much over. Rah, 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 siskumba, 40 billion, let's go team. No, now people are saying, we got to reconsider what we're doing here. We're not saying no to Ukraine, but we got to take a look at the numbers here. Militaries, including the Baltics, who are normally just let's give everything to Ukraine. The Baltics are going, cat's attacking the camera. The Baltics are going, we can't give you this because we have an obligation to NATO to maintain air defense in this territory. And if we give you this, we have no air defense. Other nations are saying, we got nothing left to give. The United States is saying, we're out of ammunition to give you. And now we have a bigger problem. The questions, remember when Rand Paul stood up back in May and said, hey, maybe we should have an inspector general because we're giving away, nearly $53 billion worth of stuff. Where's it going? What's happening to it? No, don't worry about it. Well, see, there's going to be an election next week. And the Democrats are probably going to lose the House. They may lose the Senate, but the House controls the purse. And and Biden knows that if the Republicans take over the House, he can no longer write a blank check, that there will be questions about where this stuff goes. So the rumor is that Biden's going to try and squeeze $40 to $60 billion more Ukrainian aid through a lame duck Congress. But here's the problem. The Pentagon's saying, if he does that, they're going to start asking questions about where this stuff went. And we don't have an answer. And if we can't answer it, they will shut it down now, not just later. So that's why they're sending these on-site inspection teams into Russia. There is not a person in the Pentagon that is actively thinking about what Petraeus has said. Okay, it's just not serious thought because everybody understands, everybody but the Poles, because the Poles have already gone full insane. There's already complete Polish battalions operating in Ukraine as we speak. They're fighting as battalions. It's not that they bring in the battalions, break them up. They're fighting as Polish battalions, Polish panic control, Polish logistics, everything. So Poland is committed to the fight in the tune of 10, 20, 30,000 troops already there. They just wear a Ukrainian flag, but when you intercept their communications, it's pure Polish. So Poland's already gone insane. And Russia, I think, has just accepted the insanity. And, basically, if Polish troops want to die, we'll kill them. But, Germans aren't going to put combat formations on the ground in Ukraine. The United States isn't going to do that. So there is going to be no coalition of the willing. The United States is very concerned about escalation control. How do we manage escalation? We don't want to escalate out of control. The last thing we want is a nuclear confrontation. That might be the first thing the Poles want because they're insane. But the last thing any responsible nation wants is a nuclear conflict between Russia and NATO and having NATO troops deployed. Here's the other thing, too. And this is a question that I have because Poland operating the way they are know that they're stripped of NATO protection, that there's nothing, that all the troops that go into Ukraine will die, and there's nothing NATO can do to stop them from dying because they aren't there under Article 5 because Poland wasn't attacked. And they're not there under Article 4 because NATO has not formally said we view the situation in Ukraine as a direct threat that warrants NATO intervention. A lot of people may not know, but all the big wars fought by NATO were all done under Article 4. Article 5 was invoked one time and never for war. They flew some airplanes over American soil. They put some ships in the Mediterranean. What about Afghanistan? Article 4. What about Iraq? Article 4. Libya? Article 4. Article 4 does everything. And even though there was NATO convened an Article 4 summit when this first started, NATO's never said, yeah, we view this as a threat worthy of NATO intervention. NATO said the exact opposite. We will not get involved. So I don't see Germany saying, the heck with NATO. send in the Panzer Division. I don't see Romania committing suicide, saying, let's attack Moldova. What the heck? Let's just do it. That would be the end of Romania. Because once Romanian troops leave Romanian territory without the authority of Article 4 protection, they just become targets and they will die. So Petraeus he's not speaking responsibly, nor are any of these other generals. They get paid on a by appearance basis. It used to be you'd get a monthly paycheck from these. I know because I used to get a monthly paycheck from Fox News or from NBC News. Nice paycheck. And if they used you a lot. If you were saying things they didn't like, they wouldn't put you on air, but they still had to pay you. You know, as a former intelligence officer who's pretty good at taking information and then breaking it down into what the probable sources of information were, I've taken a look at the Russian statements. I've taken a look at what they've said, and I've come up with the following conclusion. And again, people are going to just say, you're wrong. That's okay. I've been wrong before, but I think I'm right on this one. There's enough specificity in there that says certain things. One, there's clearly a source near the presidency. Now, the Russians would never have released this information if there's a source in the presidency, because you would just never talk about that. There's a source near the president, probably 3 times removed, which means a lot of what they hear is rumor, more rumor than fact. But clearly there was a dialogue within the decision-making circles surrounding the presidency about options that could be executed to bring NATO into the conflict, bring the West into the conflict. Ukraine is going through an internal crisis because they fear that the West is going to lose interest in this conflict. They fear that the fire hose of money and material that's coming in is going to be, ratcheted down. So how do we get the West to continue to invest, and even better, to bring in even more resources? I don't think Ukraine is too concerned. They would like to have boots on the ground. So how do we make that happen? And we heard one aspect of it when the foreign ministry said, if you don't support us and our economy shuts down, a wave of Ukrainian refugees are coming to Europe. So already we see Ukraine blackmailing the West. If you don't do this, then this will happen. That foreign ministry guy didn't speak on his own. He spoke because someone said, we need you to say this so we can get more support. The dirty bomb, I believe, was something discussed within the presidency. I believe it was one of the options that was going to be considered. How can we get the West in? They used the Syrian model, Duma, where the rebels created or the terrorists, whatever you want to call them, created the false flag notion of a sarin nerve agent attack that then was blown out of proportion, and it compelled the United States, Great Britain, France to launch aerial bombardment of Syria. And the Ukrainians are going, we need some of that. How do we get that done? There's already been a tremendous amount of talk about Russia doing a preemptive nuclear attack on Ukraine. It was encouraged by the president himself, who talked about NATO needing to preemptively strike Russia before Russia struck NATO. So that's in the mix. Regardless of what the reality of Russian policy is, that's in the mix. It's out there. And it's an emotional issue in the West. Zelensky knows this. So I believe that somebody said, what if we convince the West that Russia did attack us? Because this isn't a dirty bomb like a terrorist act. This is, we are going to manufacture a tactical nuclear attack on Ukraine, but we're going to intercept it with a missile so that the nuclear explosion isn't a fission, or it's going to be a fizzle. So there will be contamination without the mushroom cloud. So it's the equivalent of a dirty bomb. And they said, if we do that, then the West will have to act. And maybe they won't act nuclearly, but the West has said that if Russia uses a nuclear weapon against Ukraine, that the West will respond by destroying the Russian military capability, which is what Ukraine wants. So this is an attractive idea. I believe the president said, pursue it. Tell me what's necessary. So phone calls started being made, because that's the other aspect of this. A lot of this intelligence appears to be point A talking to point B, such as, hey, you guys have this capability. No, they have this capability. Talking. So there's intercepted phone calls with this kernel of information, and the Russians were collecting it. Now there's a Russian intelligence officer like me on the receiving end going, boom, 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 boom. Holy cow. We can't just dismiss this. I put it together and say, boss, This is the chatter we're getting. That's the Western term, chatter. This is the chatter we're getting out of Ukraine. What do we do about it? Now the Russians have to make a decision. Do we sit on this and do nothing and then have something stupid happen where we now face a crisis? Or do we preempt this? Do we nip this in the bud, knowing that the intelligence could be wrong? And I think the Russians took the wise decision, which is to get Shoigu on the phone and tell people, this is the information we have. We take this very seriously. And if you guys have any way to pressure the Ukrainians to tell them, don't do this, don't do it. And what they do by making that call is not only do they get the phone calls to be made to the Ukraine, were made, by the way, but they also are putting the West on notice that if this happens, we know what's going on, so don't you overreact. We need to manage this crisis. And I think they managed it successfully. I think the Russians, by making the phone calls that they did, got the West to pay attention and got the West to make the appropriate phone calls and shut this thing down. I think there's zero chance that Ukraine tries to pull off this dirty bomb scheme. It wouldn't have worked. That's the one thing anybody knows. Ukrainians don't have Iskander missiles, and they were saying that this was going to be an Iskander coming in over Chernobyl, which again doesn't make coming out of Belarus, by the way. And then apparently it was going to be intercepted, and then they were going to collect radiation. So first of all, they have to reverse engineer what a Soviet tactical nuke looks like, or a Russian. They know this because they had guys that used to work in that, so they know what radiological fallout would be. But now they have to reproduce it. They have to make it on their own. And any smart person, I'm not that smart, but I'd be able to figure this out because I've done this kind of investigation before. You go in and you collect the material, and you can trace nuclear material back to a nuclear reactor or a nuclear source. So it'd be immediately obvious that there wasn't a Russian nuclear device. This was a Ukrainian nuclear device made to look like a Russian nuclear device. And then you'd look at the Iskander missile, because they'd have to take the missile from other Iskander attacks, and then they'd have to seed the parts in the area. And people like me would come in and go look at the serial number and go, okay, Russia, here's the serial number. They go, yep, that was on this part. They're going to call the factory that made it. Yeah, on this part, on this missile shipped to this unit, boom. And here's the firing log. We fired that 3 months ago. That missile wasn't fired here. And here's the other thing. Russia's not been willing to release intelligence information about the IR signature of Ukrainian launches. But on something like this, Russia, I believe, would release and say, oh, this missile wasn't fired in Belarus. We tracked it. Here's the IR plume. That's where it was fired. Here's our radar track of the missile. It's a Tochka U, by the way, not an Iskander. There's nothing phony about what's going on right now in Ukraine. There's a lot of people dying. There's a lot of suffering on both sides. But we're in what I call right now, even though there's a lot of intense combat, we're in an even more intensive propaganda war. I mean, it's amazing. I'm still one of these dinosaurs that uses AOL. I know, cut me off right now, terminate our relationship. But when I log in to my email, I get this AOL screen, and immediately I'm confronted with story after story after story. And I read it, and my God, Russia just lost the war because AOL is telling me this. This is what everything's saying. Putin's being lied to by his generals who are secretly plotting a nuclear war against the West. Russia is retreating from Kherson. The troops are being annihilated. The Ukrainians are winning the artillery fight. Russia's running out of troops and ammunition. I mean, you just read it and you're like, geez, the war's over. So you read this and you're like, holy cow.
Ukrainians are dying. Americans are fighting, funding, and defining the war aims. So this goes back a long time. My political life began marching on the streets of Detroit, Michigan against the Vietnam War. My political awareness began with the Pentagon Papers, which explained that American leaders lied repeatedly about the war, mainly to get to the next election. And Daniel Ellsberg, who leaked the Pentagon Papers, wrote a wonderful essay in 1970, which has stuck with me for 52 years, where he said the quagmire myth and the stalemate machine. And he was trying to explain why the U.S. was stuck in Vietnam. And he said that the usual expression is, we walked into a quagmire. And he said that is not the right model. The right model is what he called the stalemate machine, which is never admit defeat before the next election. But since there's always a next election, you never have the opportunity to admit defeat. It was only with Richard Nixon's impeachment that actually Gerald Ford was able to end the war in Vietnam. Otherwise, it would probably have gone on for another 50 years if it had been continuous presidential administrations. We specialize in perpetual war for two reasons. One, the wars are almost always a mistake because they are an attempt to address political issues through military means in a completely flawed way. And then once in, they can't be stopped, almost without exception, or at least until 15 or 20 years has led to exhaustion. So we were in Afghanistan for 20 full years from 2001 to 2021. Biden used his first year to pull out of Afghanistan. I thought maybe there would be a year of peace, but that was a little naive on my part, because instead of negotiating with Putin at the end of 2021 over very pertinent issues like the enlargement of NATO to Ukraine, which is the main casus belli of this war, Biden said, "I will not negotiate." And so we find ourselves back at war once again. I find all of this deeply disturbing, but am extraordinarily worried that we are about to enter more war in Asia, because we are actually in two fronts now. One is the war in Ukraine, which continues to threaten to expand because, again, the model now is never allow defeat. If anything is on that path, escalate, which is not good when it's two nuclear superpowers. That's a pretty dangerous logic, but that is the prevailing logic. And if you criticize it, you're called a Putin apologist, which I am not. I want to say right at the beginning, I am nobody's apologist. I just don't like perpetual wars and think that we ought to use other means to resolve these issues. But the United States doctrine, unfortunately, is now rather explicit, and that is that to be secure, the U.S. must be the predominant power in each region of the world. So I liken it to a game that I played when I was young called Risk, which is a board game where the aim of the game is to have your piece on every part of the world map. And if you have your pieces on all but a few parts of the map, those places where you don't control could win back the territory that you have. So you're trying to have every piece on the board. Well, the United States has military bases in 80 countries around the world. But alas, for the United States, there are 193 countries. So there's a lot of wars to go. Because every place where we have a base, but there isn't a base next door, Americans feel a threat, or we're told to feel a threat. And moreover, of course, and the deeper point is China is now perceived by the United States as an existential threat to American primacy, because American policymakers cannot understand how we made the mistake of letting China become a powerful country. This was not in the playbook. China was supposed to develop in a way that is subservient to the United States. And so now we call it a failure that we made various mistakes, like letting China in the World Trade Organization or letting China play institutionally. This is obviously a mistake. Not in my view, because China did anything wrong. And as a development economist, and I think a pretty good one and a pretty knowledgeable one, I would tell you that China has managed economic development better than just about any place in world history, with a lot of skill and a tremendously high saving rate and a tremendous determination to catch up from a century of impoverishment, and they've done it quite brilliantly, in fact. But in the U.S. view, they cheated, and now they have to be punished for threatening American security. So every day you read stories about how the U.S. is cutting off technology to China, telling all of us, don't you dare buy a Huawei phone, don't you dare use Chinese technology. Every day new companies are listed on the so-called entity list, which is the American enemies list of foreign enterprises. And all of this is to say briefly that we're threatening a second front of war right now. Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan was an exemplar of complete irresponsibility, complete provocation, complete disrespect to another major power, complete abnegation of the one China policy after we had been asked repeatedly, do not go right now. And it's like, in my view, although I have to tell you, everybody hates me for saying it in the United States. I just got more hate mail before I walked on the stage. It's the same kind of provocations that led to the war in Ukraine. We'll talk about that. I'm supposed to say that this is an unprovoked war that started on February 24th because Putin is an irrational madman who thinks he's Peter the Great. That is the official line. This is not how the war started. This is not the background to the conflict. This is not an understanding, nor is it an approach that could possibly end this war safely. This war started when the United States decided it would move NATO to Ukraine and to Georgia. And if you look on a map, the idea quite explicitly laid out by Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom I knew, and who really did not like Russia as a true Polish patriot, was that we could have NATO in Ukraine, Romania, Bulgaria, Turkey, and Georgia, thereby surrounding Russia in the Black Sea, in Sevastopol. And this is, to my mind, just the second Crimean War, because that was the idea of Palmerston and Napoleon III, and we're at it again. Boris Johnson fantasized that he was Palmerston. I don't know what the Americans think, but in any event, I'm worried about a two-front war that continues to spread, because right now, one is not allowed to say one word of what I've just told you in the mainstream US media, to have this debate, to discuss the origins of the crisis, to say anything other than we fully support Ukraine, which to my mind means loving them to death, to their death. And I warned the Ukrainians that at the start of this, that they would become the Afghanistan of Europe. And by that I meant years and years of destruction, all in a patriotic call to battle, as opposed to a clear statement that the US will not expand NATO to Ukraine and Russia should get out and we should leave a space between the two superpowers and keep things safe.